So imagine, if you will, a single piece of paperwork.
Just one document.
Yeah, one document that simultaneously invents the U.S. Border Patrol, severely alters the demographic makeup of the entire United States. And
Effectively traps millions of European refugees a decade later.
right. And incredibly, it inadvertently helps trigger the rise of Japanese militarism that, led directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
I mean, it sounds like the plot of an alternate history novel.
It really does.
But it is entirely strictly historically accurate.
Exactly. So today we are opening the files on a law passed in 1924. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
We are going to unpack the Immigration Act of 1924, which is also known as the Johnson-Reed Act or the National Origins Act.
Right.
And if you are listening to this to try and understand how modern borders are drawn, I mean, you have to look at this specific moment.
You really do.
We're going to trace the intense social and political fears of the 1920s, examine the genuinely shocking role that literal eugenics played in drafting U.S. policy, and, well, we're going to reveal the mathematical sleight of hand legislators used with census data to engineer the ethnic makeup of the country.
Yeah, the math part is wild. But before we step back into the 1920s, I do need to address you, the listener, directly for a second.
Go ahead.
Because this deep dive involves highly charged historical content, including white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan, eugenics, and some really severe political rhetoric spanning the ideological spectrum. We want to make it absolutely clear to you that we are not taking any political sides.
Right, definitely not.
Nor are we endorsing the viewpoints, racial theories, or historical prejudices found in this original source material. Our job today is to impartially report on the contents of these documents to help you understand the ideas and motivations that drove this era of history.
Thank you. Having that framework is crucial, so let's set the stage.
Okay, paint the picture.
It's May 1924. President Calvin Coolidge is sitting at his desk. He's about to sign a bill that caps global immigration, specifically from outside the Western Hemisphere, at just 165,000 people a year.
Which is a tiny number.
It is. To put that in perspective, that is an astonishing 80% reduction from the pre-World War I average.
80%. Wow.
Yeah, but here's what I don't get. If you look at the 1920s, we always think of the Roaring Twenties, right?
Right. Flappers, jazz, Gatsby.
Exactly. The economy's booming, skyscrapers are going up, assembly lines are churning out Model T Fords. So why would an industrializing capitalist powerhouse suddenly want to choke off its supply of labor?
It seems counterintuitive.
It defies basic economic logic. I mean, why the drastic reduction right at that moment?
Well, that is the paradox of the 1920s. We remember the flappers and the jazz, but to understand the 1924 Act, you really have to look at the immediate aftermath of World War I.
Okay, before the roaring really started.
Exactly. The climate of fear in America was suffocating. And it was driven by two distinct, highly volatile engines. You had economic anxiety, and you had ideological paranoia.
Let's look at the economics first.
Okay, so when the war ended in 1918, millions of American soldiers returned home from the trenches. And the wartime industrial boom, the factories churning out munitions and uniforms, it just suddenly halted.
Right, the war machine turns off overnight.
Exactly. The government canceled massive manufacturing contracts. And this triggered a severe, albeit brief, post-war recession between roughly 1920 and 1921.
So people are out of work.
Unemployment spiked.
Yeah.
So you have a terrified domestic workforce. The immediate fear was that a massive, unrestricted influx of desperate immigrants from a war-torn Europe would flood the labor market.
Which would skyrocket unemployment even further.
Right, and completely crater American wages.
Okay, so the American worker is looking at the factory gates and thinking, if 1 million people show up from overseas willing to work for pennies, I can't feed my family.
That's the mindset, yeah.
That explains the economic protectionism. But you mentioned ideological paranoia. We are talking about the era immediately following the 1917 October Revolution in Russia.
Yes.
How did the Bolsheviks overthrowing the Tsar translate into immigration policy in Washington?
It translated into what we now call the First Red Scare, which peaked between 1919 and 1921.
Okay.
And this wasn't just like a vague unease about communism. It was a visceral, hysterical panic.
People were actually freaking out.
Completely. The American public was watching the Russian Empire collapse into a violent communist revolution. And there was a widespread belief that foreign radicals, specifically anarchists, socialists, and communists, were migrating to the United States with the express purpose of undermining American values.
And staging a violent uprising.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just imaginary paranoia, right? I mean, the fear was definitely blown out of proportion, but there were actual events fueling it.
Oh, absolutely.
You had the mail bombings in 1919 where anarchists sent dynamite to prominent politicians and business leaders.
Precisely. You had bombs going off in major cities. You had massive violent labor strikes like the Seattle General Strike and the Boston Police Strike.
So it felt like chaos.
To the average American reading the newspaper in 1920, it genuinely felt like the fabric of society was unraveling. And the government's response was the Palmer Raids.
Right, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer.
Yeah, where thousands of suspected radical immigrants were rounded up and deported without due process. The narrative became deeply ingrained. Foreign equals radical, and radical equals a threat to the nation.
Okay, so on the East Coast, you have people looking across the Atlantic Ocean at a shattered Europe. They see poverty, unemployment, and communist revolution,
Right.
and they are terrified it is all going to spill onto American shores.
That's the East Coast view, yeah.
But if we pivot and look at the West Coast, the anxiety has a completely different flavor. They aren't looking at Europe, they're looking at Asia.
A totally different demographic reality.
And from the source documents we have, the rhetoric coming out of California isn't just about jobs or anarchism, it's incredibly militarized.
Yes. The West Coast anxiety was heavily racialized under the banner of what was historically termed the Yellow Peril.
All right.
You have to remember the historical context here. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already severely choked off Chinese immigration decades earlier.
So the Chinese population wasn't the primary focus anymore.
Exactly. But by the 1920s, you had a new demographic reality. Japanese, Korean, and Filipino laborers who were initially brought in to replace the excluded Chinese workers in agriculture and railroad construction were now putting down deep roots in the western United States.
They weren't just passing through.
No, they were buying land, starting businesses, and having children. And this permanence sparked a massive, highly organized exclusionary movement among white citizens in places like California.
I was looking through our sources at a quote from a man named Valentine S. McClatchy.
Oh, he's a key figure here.
Yeah, he was the publisher of the Sacramento Bee, the founder of the McClatchy Company, and a major, highly influential leader in this anti-Japanese movement.
Very influential.
He went to Congress to argue against these Asian immigrants, and his specific words were, and this is a quote, "They come here specifically and professedly for the purpose of colonizing and establishing here permanently the proud Yamato race."
That specific vocabulary is not accidental at all.
Exactly. That's what jumped out at me. If you're a farmer in California and another farmer moves in next door, you might view them as a competitor.
Sure.
But McClatchy isn't calling them competitors. He's using words like colonizing.
Right.
He is framing these immigrants, who are just individuals trying to grow strawberries or run a shop, as a literal vanguard, an invading military force setting up a colony for a foreign empire.
It's pure threat escalation.
So how does that hyper-militarized rhetoric move from a newspaper publisher's mouth into the actual drafting of a federal bill?
It moves very smoothly when the politicians drafting the bill rely on that rhetoric to secure votes.
Ah, of course. Politics.
That narrative of a silent demographic invasion successfully catalyzed politicians to write an outright ban into the 1924 Act. The legislation included a deeply insidious clause.
What did it say?
It mandated that no alien ineligible to become a citizen could be admitted to the U.S. as an immigrant.
Wait, explain that mechanism. How does ineligible for citizenship translate to an immigration ban?
It ties back to existing naturalization laws. Under the laws of the time, dating back to the late 18th and 19th centuries, naturalized citizenship was generally restricted to free white persons and persons of African nativity or descent.
Okay, so Asians were excluded from that.
Therefore, Asian immigrants were already legally categorized as aliens ineligible to citizenship.
I see.
By writing that exact phrase into the 1924 immigration bill, Congress created a perfectly closed loop.
So they didn't even have to name them.
While the act didn't explicitly name Japanese or Korean individuals, that was exactly who it was aimed at. In effect, the act completely banned all immigrants from Asia.
All of them.
The only exception was the Philippines, and that was strictly because the Philippines was a U.S. territory at the time, meaning its citizens were technically U.S. nationals who could travel to the mainland.
Okay, so we have a foundation of raw fear. Economic anxiety about jobs, ideological panic about communism and blatant militarized xenophobia on the West Coast.
A very toxic mix.
But if you look at human history, fear of the other is tragically common. I mean, politicians have been standing on soapboxes shouting about foreign threats since the Roman Empire.
Sure.
What makes the 1924 Act so unique and honestly so deeply unsettling to read about today is how these fears were legitimized.
Yes.
They didn't just use angry rhetoric, they wrapped their prejudice in a lab coat.
That's a great way to put it.
If you want to understand how this bill passed, you have to look at the pseudoscience of exclusion.
This is perhaps the most crucial and sobering element of the entire deep dive. The two main architects of the act were U.S. Representative Albert Johnson of Washington State and Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania.
Johnson and Reed.
When they spoke on the floor of Congress, they didn't just speak in terms of union wages or national security. They spoke in biological, genetic terms. They explicitly stated that they conceived the act as a necessary bulwark against a stream of alien blood.
A stream of alien blood. Again, look at the language. That is not the vocabulary of trade tariffs or border security.
Not at all.
That is the vocabulary of a biology textbook being weaponized.
Precisely. Senator Reed argued to the Senate that earlier legislation had focused too much on the newcomers and disregarded the people who were already born in America.
Okay.
He stated he wanted to keep American stock, and he explicitly meant genetic stock, up to the highest standard.
Meaning white Northern European.
He argued that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were predominantly Catholic and Jewish, were arriving sick, starving, and were biologically incapable of contributing to the economy or assimilating into American culture.
And to justify this biologically, they turn to eugenics. Now, if you are listening to this, you might have heard the term eugenics in relation to some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. But let's define what it actually meant in the context of 1920s America. Eugenics was a completely discredited pseudoscience that claimed you could and should improve the human race by selectively breeding out undesirable traits and promoting desirable ones.
That's the core of it.
But the key here is that in 1924, this wasn't considered some fringe dark web conspiracy theory.
Not at all.
Yeah.
That is a vital distinction to make. In the 1920s, eugenics was treated as a cutting-edge, legitimate scientific discipline.
It was mainstream.
Very mainstream. It was taught in major Ivy League universities. It was funded by prominent philanthropic organizations. It was discussed in polite society.
That is just so hard to wrap your head around today.
The proponents of eugenics argued that traits like poverty, criminality, and what they called feeble-mindedness were strictly hereditary. And they tied these supposedly hereditary traits directly to specific races and ethnicities.
So they basically created a biological hierarchy of human value.
Exactly. So in 1924, lawmakers were explicitly using this mainstream pseudoscience to restrict certain ethnicities, claiming they were scientifically obligated to prevent the spread of genetic inferiority in American society.
But the integration of eugenics into the government goes far beyond a few senators quoting a textbook. The institutionalization of this is staggering.
It really is.
The United States Congress literally had a eugenics subcommittee.
Yes. The House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization created a specialized eugenics subcommittee.
Unbelievable.
And the man they appointed as the expert advisor to this committee during the entire legislative process was Harry Laughlin.
Okay, explain who Harry Laughlin was, because his role here is the linchpin.
Harry Laughlin was one of the most prominent eugenicists in the United States. He was the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office in New York.
So this is his whole life's work.
His entire career was dedicated to compiling data, which we now know was deeply flawed and heavily biased, to prove that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had overwhelmingly higher rates of insanity, criminality, and intellectual disability compared to older Northern European immigrant populations.
And he brings this to Congress.
He presented this data to Congress as undeniable, objective scientific fact. He testified repeatedly, presenting charts and graphs, essentially arguing that the American gene pool was being polluted.
And Congress just swallowed this whole...
They didn't just swallow it. They enthusiastically built a legal apparatus around it.
Jeez.
After the bill passed, Laughlin didn't just celebrate a political victory. He praised the law specifically as a political breakthrough in the adoption of scientific racism as a theoretical foundation for immigration policy.
Wait, he actually called it scientific racism.
He literally used the phrase scientific racism as a point of pride.
That phrase stops you in your tracks. Scientific racism. If you're listening to this and wondering how a democratic government justifies something like that out loud, It really comes down to how the law essentially redefined what it meant to be an American.
Yes.
I was reading the analysis in our sources by historian Guy, and she makes a brilliant point about what this pseudoscience actually accomplished legally.
Mine Guy's analysis is essential here. She points out that the 1924 law operated on two distinct levels.
Okay.
On the surface, the practical level, it differentiated Europeans according to nationality, ranking them in a hierarchy of desirability.
Yeah.
British and German immigrants were at the top. Italians and Eastern European Jews were at the bottom.
Right.
But on a deeper, more profound level, the law effectively constructed a white American race.
Let's unpack that. What does it mean to legally construct a race?
Before this period, people didn't necessarily view all Europeans as one cohesive white race.
Oh, right. Because of religious and ethnic tensions.
Exactly. A wealthy Anglo-Saxon Protestant in Boston did not view a poor Catholic Sicilian immigrant as being of the same race.
They were seen as distinct groups.
But Niga argues that the 1924 Act, by grouping all these European nationalities into a quota system that excluded Asians and heavily restricted others, legally synthesized a new identity.
A shared categories.
It created a legal framework where persons of European descent, despite their different nationalities, shared a common whiteness that was legally, socially, and politically distinct from those deemed not white.
Wow. So the law didn't just reflect the racial categories of the time, it actively manufactured them and codified them into the administrative state.
Yes.
So they essentially used the law to define what whiteness was, and then used eugenics to justify protecting that definition.
That's the core machinery of the Act.
We have now established the why. We know the fear, the economic panic, and the pseudoscience that drove the motivation.
Right.
But motivation isn't legislation. You can't just write a federal law that says no Italians or Eastern European Jews allowed.
No, that would cause an international crisis.
Exactly. That violates a dozen international treaties, it's a diplomatic nightmare, and it's too legally blunt. So they didn't use names. They used math.
They weaponized the United States Census.
This brings us to the actual mechanics of the law. How do you legally engineer a demographic shift without explicitly stating it?
This is where the bureaucratic engineering comes in.
Okay.
And to understand the trick they pulled in 1924, we actually have to look 3 years earlier to 1921.
Okay, the 1921 Emergency Quota Act. How did that work?
In 1921, Congress passed a stopgap measure. It established the first numerical limits on European immigration.
Okay.
The formula was relatively straightforward. It limited annual immigration from any given country to 3% of the number of foreign-born persons of that specific nationality who were residing in the U.S. at the time of the 1910 census.
Let's do the math out loud so we can see how this works.
Sure.
Let's say we look at the 1910 census, and it shows there are exactly 100,000 people born in country X currently living in the United States. Under the 1921 law, country X gets an annual immigration quota of 3% of that number. So 3,000 people from country X can immigrate this year. Simple enough.
Exactly. It tied future immigration directly to the existing demographic footprint.
Makes sense on paper.
But for architects like Albert Johnson and the eugenics advocates like Harry Laughlin, the 1921 law was fundamentally flawed.
Why?
It wasn't restrictive enough overall, and more importantly, it didn't target the right people in their eyes.
I don't get it. The 1910 census was just 10 years prior.
Because by 1910, the massive wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe had already been happening for 2 decades.
Oh, I see.
There were already millions of Italians, Poles, and Eastern European Jews living in the U.S. by 1910. Therefore, 3% of a very large number still resulted in tens of thousands of those specific immigrants arriving every year.
So the quotas were too high for the groups they hated.
The eugenicists looked at those numbers and said, this isn't working. We are still letting in too much alien blood.
So they go back to the drawing board for the 1924 Act. The first thing they do is turn the dial down on the percentage. They drop the quota from 3% to 2%.
Yes.
That tightens the valve a bit, but that is not the smoking gun of this legislation. The real mathematical sleight of hand was changing the baseline year.
Yes. The 1924 Act completely abandoned the 1910 census. Keep in mind, they are drafting this law in 1924.
Right.
They have a perfectly fresh, highly accurate census from 1920 sitting right in front of them.
The most recent data available.
But Congress legally mandated that the new 2% quotas must be calculated using the data from the 1890 census.
I want you to really think about how absurd this is. It is 1924. You have 1920 data,
Yeah.
but you pass a federal law insisting that your government must ignore reality and base its formulas on data that is some 4 years old.
It's completely ahistorical.
That is like a modern tech company trying to understand smartphone usage today, but insisting their algorithms can only use data from the year 2004 before the iPhone even existed.
That's a great analogy.
Why deliberately look backwards? What was so magical about the year 1890?
It was a mathematically sinister brilliance.
Yeah.
Madison Grant, the chair of the eugenics subcommittee, and Harry Laughlin heavily pushed for the 1890 census for one very specific demographic reason.
Which was?
1890 was the exact moment before the massive demographic shift in American immigration occurred. If you look at American immigration prior to 1890, the vast majority of immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, places like Great Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia.
The people the eugenicists liked.
Exactly. The massive wave of Italian Catholics and Eastern European Jews didn't truly explode until the late 1890s and the early 1900s.
So the trap clicks into place. If you use the 1910 or 1920 census, you have to acknowledge the millions of Italians and Eastern Europeans already living in America.
Yes.
Which means their 2% quota would be relatively high. But if you rewind the clock and point your legal time machine at 1890...
You artificially shrink their baseline population to almost zero.
That is so deeply manipulative.
By legally pretending it is 1890, the act magically allocated 85% of the total global immigration quota to Northern and Western Europe.
85%.
It systematically punished Southern and Eastern Europe without ever having to write the words Italian or Jewish into the restrictive clauses. It was demographic engineering disguised as arithmetic.
The numbers in our sources just lay bare how devastating this math was. Let's look at Italy.
The Italian numbers are shocking.
From 1901 to 1914, an average of 210,000 Italians immigrated to the United States every single year. They were building the infrastructure of American cities.
Yeah.
Under the new 1924 quota, using the 1890 census time machine, that number plummeted from 210,000 a year down to just 4,000 per year. 4,000.
A total collapse.
Meanwhile, Germany, which was a favored Northern European nation with a massive population already in the U.S. in 1890, was granted an annual quota of over 55,000. Great Britain got over 34,000.
The math functioned exactly as the eugenicists designed it to.
Yeah.
But it is important to note that this 1890 census trick was originally written as a temporary measure.
Oh,
Yeah, the law stated that the 1890 baseline would only be used until 1929. In 1929, a new permanent quota system would be implemented, and this one would be based on the more recent 1920 census.
Wait, if they switched to the 1920 census in 1929, doesn't that undo the whole trick? The Italians and Eastern Europeans are in the 1920 census?
You would think so, but the architects of the law anticipated that. They found a way to manipulate the 1929 update as well.
How?
The 1929 system wasn't a flat 2% of foreign-born residents. It was based on the national origins of the total U.S. population in 1920.
Okay, total population.
They would calculate the ethnic makeup of the entire country and distribute the 150,000 total quota slots proportionally. But to ensure that quotas remained overwhelmingly weighted toward white Northern European nations, the law purposefully mandated that the baseline population calculation would not include certain groups.
Who did they exclude from the math?
The law explicitly stated that the demographic baseline would not include Black Americans, mulattoes, or Asians.
You have got to be kidding me.
They legally erased millions of minority citizens from the demographic reality of the United States.
So they just pretended they didn't exist.
If they had included Black Americans in the baseline, the proportion of white Americans would have been lower, thereby lowering the quotas for European nations.
Wow.
By erasing non-white citizens from the equation, they artificially inflated the percentage of the population that was of European descent, ensuring the quotas favored the demographics they desired.
It is truly staggering. When you see the mechanics of it laid out on the table like that, it's not an accident. It is precision engineering.
Absolutely.
So the trap is set. They have the pseudoscience of eugenics providing the biological justification, and they have the weaponized time machine census math providing the legal mechanism.
Right.
But to get a bill passed into law, you need votes. You need massive political coalitions. Who exactly pushed this over the finish line? Because when you look at the political alignments of 1924, you find some very, very strange bedfellows.
You certainly do. When you look at the coalition that supported the Johnson-Reed Act, some of it is entirely expected, and some of it is deeply paradoxical.
Let's start with the expected.
On one hand, you had rabidly nativist and xenophobic groups. The Ku Klux Klan, which had experienced a massive resurgence in the 1920s, and wielded significant political power in both the South and the Midwest, fiercely supported the bill.
Well, obvious.
They marched in Washington to support it. That aligns perfectly with the racial and religious rhetoric we've discussed. The Klan was anti-Black, anti-Catholic, and anti-Semitic.
Right. The Klan supporting a eugenics-based immigration ban tracks with everything we know about history. But here is the part that genuinely shocked me when I was reviewing the sources.
Labor unions.
Yes. Alongside the Ku Klux Klan, you had massive organized support from the American Federation of Labor, the AFL.
Yes, the most powerful labor union in the country.
And the founder and president of the AFL was Samuel Gompers. Now, if you know anything about labor history, you know Gompers. But look at his biography.
It's quite the contradiction.
Samuel Gompers was himself a Jewish immigrant who came to the U.S. from Britain. He experienced the immigrant struggle firsthand.
You did.
Yet, he throws the full, immense political weight of the AFL behind this act, an act that he knows is explicitly designed by eugenicists to severely restrict Jewish immigration.
Yep.
Why? If you are sitting there wondering why a Jewish immigrant would lobby for a bill supported by the KKK that targets Jewish refugees, it feels inexplicable.
It feels inexplicable until you look at it strictly through the lens of labor economics.
Right.
For Gompers, economic protectionism ultimately overrode any sense of ethnic solidarity.
Wow.
We have to understand the union's position. The AFL's entire purpose was to improve wages, shorten working hours, and secure better working conditions for its members.
Right.
Gompers fundamentally believed that a constant, unrestricted influx of desperate immigrants, people who were fleeing poverty and were willing to work for practically nothing, would perpetually flood the labor market.
It's the law of supply and demand. If the factory owner has 1,000 men outside the gate willing to work for $1 a day, the union inside the factory loses all its leverage to demand $2 a day.
Exactly. Gompers viewed mass immigration as a weapon used by industrial capitalists to break strikes and depress wages.
So to him, closing the border was pro-worker.
He believed that the only way to build a strong, middle-class labor force in America was to artificially restrict the supply of labor. If labor is scarce, labor is valuable.
Interesting.
For Gompers, closing the border was the ultimate union protection mechanism. He was willing to close the door on people fleeing the exact same poverty he fled because he believed it was the only way to protect the American worker who was already here.
It is a phenomenal insight into how resources, or the perceived scarcity of resources, can force alliances between groups that otherwise despise each other.
Absolutely.
The Klan wants them out for biological reasons. The unions want them out for economic reasons. They meet in the middle and pass the bill.
Huh.
But there was opposition, right? It wasn't unanimous.
No, it wasn't.
Who was standing up against this tidal wave?
There was opposition, but they were severely outnumbered and swimming against the political current. In the House of Representatives, one of the most vocal and vigorous opponents was a freshman congressman from Brooklyn named Emanuel Seller.
Emanuel Seller.
He was a Jewish American, and he didn't mince words. He loudly called out the act's blatant mathematical discrimination against Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. He pointed out the absurdity of the eugenics arguments.
And he actually spent the next 40 years of his life fighting this exact law, right? He eventually helps tear it down in 1965.
Yes, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which finally abolished the national origins quota system, bears his name.
That's a legacy right there.
But in 1924, he was a lonely voice. You also had Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes opposing the act, primarily because he saw the diplomatic disaster it was going to cause, calling the exclusion clauses quite unnecessary.
And in the Senate.
In the Senate, progressive voices like Wisconsin Senator Robert M. La Follette argued passionately that the bill was fundamentally inhumane and would inflict untold misery on millions of would-be immigrants.
But the most dramatic climax of this entire legislative battle, the moment where it all almost fell apart, didn't come from a congressman in Washington.
No, it came from across the Pacific.
Right. We talked earlier about the West Coast paranoia regarding the yellow peril and the specific clause banning Asians. Well, the Japanese government was absolutely furious about this.
They were. And to understand why, you have to look at the geopolitical dynamic.
Okay.
By 1924, Japan had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. They had been an allied power in World War I, and they viewed themselves, rightfully, as a rapidly modernizing top-tier global power.
They were a major player.
They had maintained a relatively cordial economic and political relationship with the U.S., governed by a gentleman's agreement, where Japan voluntarily restricted its own emigration to ease tensions.
So Japan is saying, we are already playing ball. We are already restricting our citizens to help you out.
Exactly. And then Congress writes a law legally defining Japanese people as racially ineligible to immigrate.
Which is just a slap in the face.
To the Japanese government, this felt like a massive public betrayal, a profound national insult. The Japanese foreign minister, Matsui Kishiro, instructed his ambassador in Washington, Masanao Hanehara, to write a formal, highly diplomatic, but incredibly stern letter of protest to Secretary of State Hughes.
And the wording of this letter is critical to how the vote actually goes down. Let's look at what Hanehara actually wrote.
Hanehara wrote that the manifest object of the law was to single out Japanese people as a nation, stigmatizing them as unworthy and undesirable in the eyes of the American people.
Which is exactly what the law was doing.
He pointed out the sheer mathematical absurdity of the insult. Based on the 2% quota formula, if Japan had just been given a normal quota like a European country, it would have amounted to a mere 146 Japanese immigrants a year.
Wait, 146 people?
Yes, the formula would have yielded exactly 146 people.
That is nothing.
Hanehara is basically saying, you are causing a massive international incident and insulting a global empire just to stop 146 people from moving to California.
Unbelievable.
And then he ended the letter with a standard diplomatic warning. He wrote that he felt compelled to warn of the grave consequences that this enactment would inevitably bring upon the otherwise happy and mutually advantageous relations between the two countries.
Okay, so if you read that in the context of international diplomacy, grave consequences means we are going to raise tariffs, we are going to cancel trade deals, our relationship is going to sour.
Right, it's economic fallout.
It's a warning about diplomatic fallout. But how does the U.S. Senate react when they read those two words?
They seize upon it instantly.
Yeah.
Hardliners in the Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, get their hands on this letter.
Oh, boy.
And instead of reading it as a diplomatic protest, they deliberately spin the phrase grave consequences as a literal physical military threat against the United States.
They treat it like a declaration of war.
Exactly. Lodge goes to the Senate floor and essentially says, the Japanese Empire is threatening us with grave consequences if we pass our own domestic law. We cannot let a foreign nation dictate American policy through threats of violence.
Wow, what a spin.
It was a completely manufactured spin, but it was incredibly effective. It whipped up nationalist anger. Any senator who might have been on the fence or who might have voted against the bill to preserve trade relations was suddenly painted into a corner.
Right. If you voted against the bill now, you looked like you were bowing to a foreign threat.
It's a brilliant, if utterly cynical, parliamentary maneuver. It forces the vote through.
But what about the president? Calvin Coolidge is a pro-business Republican. He knows this is going to hurt trade. Why doesn't he veto it?
Election year politics.
Always.
1924 was a presidential election year. Coolidge knew that the bill had massive populist support from the unions to the nativists to the general public whipped up by the Red Scare. Vetoing the bill would have been political suicide.
He couldn't risk it.
And even if he had stood on principle and vetoed it, the margins in Congress were overwhelmingly against him. The Senate passed the final version of the bill with a vote of 69-9. The House passed it 3-8 to 58.
So it was veto-proof anyway?
It was veto-proof, 2/3 majority in both houses.
Mm-hmm.
The die was cast.
So on May 24, 1924, Coolidge signs the bill. We've spent a lot of time in the quiet rooms of Washington looking at the paperwork, the census math, the eugenics hearings, the parliamentary spin.
The bureaucratic side.
Right. But as we know, legislation doesn't stay on paper. A law is just ink until a government enforces it. If you have just banned millions of people from entering the country, how do you actually stop them at a physical border that, up until now, was essentially open?
That's the million-dollar question.
Let's transition to the immediate physical realities on the ground, because the mechanics of the border changed almost overnight.
They absolutely did. The 1924 Act invented two massive logistical systems that fundamentally created the modern border apparatus we still live with today.
What's the first one?
First, it literally authorized the creation of the United States Border Patrol.
It's wild to think the Border Patrol didn't exist before 1924. If someone wanted to walk across the border from Mexico or Canada in 1915, who stopped them?
Nobody, really. There were mounted watchmen who looked for Chinese immigrants trying to smuggle themselves in after the 1882 Exclusion Act, and customs agents looking for untaxed goods, but there was no systemic patrol of the physical border.
It was just a line on a map.
But the 1924 Act changed the paradigm. If you suddenly severely restrict the front door, The ports of New York and Boston people are inevitably going to seek a side door.
Sure, human nature.
Lawmakers realized that European and Asian immigrants would simply sail to Mexico or Canada, which had no quotas, and walk across the land border.
So the creation of the Border Patrol wasn't even initially about Mexican or Canadian citizens. It was to stop Europeans and Asians from bypassing the quotas via the land borders.
Exactly. The Border Patrol was established just 2 days after the act was passed. Congress initially appropriated $1 million to hire 450 patrol inspectors.
450 guys for the whole border?
Yeah, they were issued badges and revolvers and tasked with patrolling thousands of miles of incredibly porous, difficult terrain, primarily along the Mexico-U.S. border. This is the moment the southern border transitions from a line on a map into a militarized zone of enforcement.
Okay, so that is the physical enforcement on the land. But what about the ports? What about the millions of people trying to cross the ocean? You mentioned a second massive creation.
Yes, and this second creation was perhaps even more globally impactful, the consular control system.
How did an immigrant get to America before 1924?
Before this act, the journey was relatively unregulated on the departure side. If you were a farmer in Italy, you saved up your money, you went to a port like Naples, you bought a steamship ticket, and you got on the boat.
Okay.
You sailed across the Atlantic and you arrived at Ellis Island. The inspection, the medical checks, the legal checks happened after you arrived on American soil.
And if you failed?
If you failed the inspection, the steamship company had to sail you back at their own expense.
Which was incredibly tragic. People would sell everything they own, make the brutal journey, and be turned away at the gates of New York.
It was heartbreaking. But the 1924 Act completely dismantled that system. It mandated that immigrants could no longer just show up at a U.S. port.
So what did they have to do?
They now had to obtain a valid immigration visa from an American consulate abroad before they were even legally allowed to purchase a ticket or board a ship.
So they essentially pushed the U.S. border out into foreign countries. They outsourced the gatekeeping.
Precisely. It created what historians call a double layer of protection. First, you had to travel to a city in your home country that had a U.S. embassy or consulate.
Okay.
You had to apply for a visa, prove you didn't violate the quotas, undergo medical and background checks by American officials operating on foreign soil, and wait for approval.
All before leaving home.
If you passed that, you got the visa. Then you made the journey. And then you were checked again upon arrival in the U.S.
That gives the State Department immense, unprecedented control over who even starts the journey. You don't have to deport people if you never let them on the boat.
And it fundamentally transformed the logistics of global travel. The visa system we all use today to travel internationally, that bureaucratic hurdle of going to an embassy and getting a stamp and a passport, was largely popularized and institutionalized by the requirements of the 1924 Act.
So the U.S. throws up these massive bureaucratic and physical walls. Let's look at the global shockwaves of this action, because when you slam a door that hard, the sound echoes.
It reverberates everywhere.
Let's go back to Japan. They warned about grave consequences, and the U.S. Senate essentially laughed in their faces and passed the ban anyway. What actually happened in Tokyo when the news broke?
The reaction in Japan was a mixture of intense, profound sorrow and furious national anger. It was viewed across Japanese society as an unforgivable national humiliation.
They felt completely betrayed.
The U.S. essentially told them, "We do not view you as equals on the world stage, and we do not view your people as biologically fit to live among us."
Wow.
The diplomatic fallout was immediate. Japanese ambassadors, including Hanehara, resigned in protest. The Japanese government retaliated economically by heavily hiking tariffs on American goods by 100%, which severely hurt American businesses operating in the Pacific.
And there was a visceral public reaction too, wasn't there?
Yes, there were massive anti-American boycotts, and there was a highly publicized, deeply tragic incident where an unknown Japanese citizen committed seppuku ritual suicide right near the compound of the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo.
That is just chilling.
He left behind a note that simply read, "Appealing to the American people." The sense of betrayal was absolute.
That is heartbreaking, and it goes far beyond just a temporary diplomatic freeze. In our sources, historian David C. Atkinson traces the long-term political domino effect this had inside Japan, and it is honestly terrifying.
Atkinson's analysis is vital. During the 1920s, Japan actually had a growing, albeit fragile, democratic movement.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There were liberal, pro-Western politicians who were arguing for international cooperation, disarmament, and peaceful trade with the United States and Britain.
That sounds like a completely different path.
But the passage of the American Immigration Act of 1924 dealt a near-fatal blow to that democratic movement.
Because it made the pro-Western politicians look weak.
Exactly. The hardline, right-wing militarists in Japan looked at the liberal politicians and said, "You advocate for friendship with the Americans. Look at how they treat us. They despise us. They pass racist laws against us."
That's powerful political ammunition.
They argued, "We cannot rely on international cooperation. We must rely on military strength and imperial expansion to secure our future."
So the racist quota passed in a quiet room in Washington in 1924 directly undermines Japanese democracy.
Yes. Atkinson notes that this humiliation opened the door for those anti-Western militarists to gradually take control of the Japanese government in the late 1920s and 1930s.
Leading to World War II.
It is widely seen by historians as a major turning point, a catalyst in the growing estrangement between the U.S. and Japan, setting the two empires on a slow, grinding collision course that ultimately culminated in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941.
It is terrifying to trace that line of causality. You change a census baseline year in Washington, and 17 years later, battleships are burning in Hawaii.
Actions have massive unintended consequences.
And Japan wasn't the only place where the 1924 Act had devastating historical consequences. Let's look across the Atlantic at Europe, specifically the impact on Jewish migration, because the math they invented was about to collide with the darkest chapter of the 20th century.
The impact here is profoundly dark. As we discussed earlier, the 1890 census math was explicitly designed to target and restrict Eastern and Southern Europeans.
Right, the time machine algorithm.
Well, demographically, nearly 75% of all Jewish immigrants in the U.S. prior to 1924 had come from Russia and Eastern Europe.
Oh, wow.
Because mass migration from those areas didn't really start until the late 1890s. Using the 1890 baseline effectively made mass migration from Eastern Europe, where the vast majority of the global Jewish diaspora lived at the time, mathematically impossible.
The door was slammed shut. The quota for countries like Poland and Russia dropped to practically nothing.
Yes.
And this had an immediate demographic shift, right? Because millions of Jewish people who were facing rising anti-Semitism and pogroms in Eastern Europe could no longer come to America. They had to go somewhere else. This spurred what is known as the Fourth Aliyah.
Correct. Blocked from entering the United States, a massive wave of Jewish emigration turned toward mandatory Palestine. The British Peel Commission in 1937 specifically noted that the drastic American quotas were a primary factor in spurring immigration levels to Palestine that hadn't been previously anticipated.
Which obviously drastically altered the demographic and political landscape of the Middle East.
Tremendously.
But the absolute grimmest historical footnote regarding the 1924 Act is what happened in the decades immediately following its passage. We move into the 1930s.
The rise of the Third Reich.
Exactly. The Nazi Party rises to power in Germany. They begin their systemic, brutal persecution of the Jews. The Nuremberg laws are passed. A massive, desperate refugee crisis emerges as Jewish families try to flee Europe.
And they look to the United States for asylum.
Right. They're desperately trying to get visas. But what happens with the quotas? Does Congress look at the humanitarian crisis and say, okay, the circumstances have changed, we need to lift the 2% cap?
No, they do not. The United States government did not modify the quotas.
At all.
Despite the obvious, well-documented, and escalating horrors of the Holocaust, the strict numerical limits established by the eugenics-driven math of the 1920s were rigidly kept in place. The law was simply not altered to aid Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany.
That is just sickening.
There are countless tragic stories of families who were denied visas because the quota for their birth country was already full for the year. They were trapped.
And so they couldn't escape.
The quota system worked exactly as its original architects designed it to, keeping undesirables out, regardless of the humanitarian cost.
It is incredibly sobering. You realize that a mathematical formula designed to protect a manufactured idea of racial purity ended up being a death sentence for thousands of people.
It really was.
And look, even if we step away from the profound moral and humanitarian tragedies, even if we look purely at the domestic, cold, hard economic outcomes that people like union leader Samuel Gompers were so worried about, the act still managed to backfire spectacularly on the United States.
Oh, the economics of it totally failed.
We now have modern economic studies looking back at a century of data. What did this restriction actually do to the American economy?
It did the exact opposite of what Gompers and the protectionists hoped it would do.
How so?
Economists Petra Moser and Shmuel Sand published a highly detailed paper in 2020 analyzing the long-term economic impact of the 1924 quotas. They focused on science and innovation.
Okay.
They found that the drastic, sudden reduction in immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe caused a significant, measurable drop in American scientific innovation.
Because fewer immigrant scientists were arriving.
That is part of it, but it goes deeper. There were vastly fewer new patents filed, yes, because the immigrant scientists were kept out. But the study found a sharp decline in patents filed by native-born American scientists as well.
Wait, native-born Americans stopped inventing as much. Why?
By cutting off the flow of international talent, the U.S. isolated its own scientific community. Native-born scientists were no longer collaborating with, competing against, or being pushed by brilliant international peers. The entire ecosystem of innovation stagnated.
Wow. So trying to protect American exceptionalism actually weakened it? But what about the blue-collar workers? The folks Gompers was trying to protect, the miners, the farmers, the factory workers who were terrified of cheap labor driving down their wages.
The everyday worker.
Right. Did the 1924 Act usher in a golden age of high wages for the American working class?
Not according to the data. A major 2023 study published in the American Economic Journal looked specifically at the industries most affected by the sudden loss of cheap immigrant labor.
And what did they find?
And the findings are fascinating. The end of that labor pool didn't lead to factory owners suddenly doubling wages for native-born workers. Instead, capitalist industries adapted to the scarcity.
How did they adapt?
Well, the agricultural sector, which was highly reliant on migrant labor, shifted rapidly towards capital-intensive methods. Instead of paying higher wages to American farmhands, farm owners invested heavily in mechanization.
So tractors, reapers, automated systems.
Exactly. They replaced the missing immigrants with machines.
Oh.
The mining industry, which was also heavily reliant on immigrant labor in places like Appalachia, couldn't automate as easily, so it simply contracted. Mines closed down.
So jobs just disappeared.
Ultimately, the economic contraction in some sectors and the rapid shift toward mechanization in others ended up economically harming the very U.S.-born workers the act was ostensibly supposed to protect. The American worker didn't get a raise, they got replaced by a machine, or they lost their job when the industry shrank.
So if we step back and look at the entire massive picture we've painted today, let's summarize the journey of this single piece of legislation.
It's a heavy journey.
We started in an America gripped by post-World War I economic anxiety and the ideological hysteria of the Red Scare. Those very real, very potent fears were weaponized by lawmakers pushing the mainstream pseudoscience of eugenics.
Right, the biological threat narrative.
Because they couldn't explicitly ban people by nationality without causing chaos, they reached back into the past. They pulled out outdated 1890 census data to mathematically engineer a quota system that artificially inflated Northern European numbers and erased everyone else.
The time machine algorithm.
And they used that algorithm to preserve a manufactured ideal of racial homogeneity.
And the consequences of that bureaucratic engineering were seismic. They inadvertently sparked global chain reactions that defined the 20th century.
Seriously.
They created the modern border apparatus and the consular visa system. They accidentally fueled the rise of Japanese militarism by humiliating a rising Pacific power. They stifled their own domestic economic and scientific innovation.
It's just failure after failure.
And, most tragically, they shut the door on millions of refugees right before one of the darkest periods in human history, trapping them in Europe.
It is a phenomenal, terrifying example of how bureaucracy is never neutral. Every number, every baseline year, every percentage point in a law has a philosophy behind it and real-world consequences ahead of it. We look at the paperwork and think it is just administration, but it is destiny.
It truly is. And before we close, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply chilling piece of historical context to mull over.
Okay, what is it?
We spent this whole deep dive looking at how America's fears shaped this law and how the law impacted the rest of the world. But the ultimate legacy of the Immigration Act of 1924 wasn't just domestic. The eugenic framework and the concept of legally manufacturing racial demographics didn't go unnoticed abroad.
Oh, no.
4 years after the act passed, in 1928, a rising radical political figure in Europe published a book where he explicitly and publicly praised the American immigration law.
Seriously?
He praised it for its success in banishing what he called strangers of the blood. He expressed deep admiration for how the United States had managed to legally, methodically exclude foreign racial masses from its gene pool.
Let me guess.
That European leader was Adolf Hitler.
Wow.
He wrote about the American quota system in his unpublished second book, and the framers of his later regime would go on to cite U.S. immigration and segregation law favorably when drafting their own racist exclusionary legislation in the 1930s.
That is just devastating.
It invites us to consider a very dark reality: how laws designed in a quiet room to protect a nation's identity can end up writing the blueprints for history's darkest chapters across the globe.
So the next time you hear about a shift in a quota, a change in a baseline year, or a debate over the math of a border, well, remember that the muddy waters of bureaucratic policy are never just math. They are the blueprints of the future. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, something to think about.